Hey, friends. So, wow, lots converging right now as far as the past few days. I've had several insights around this area of boundaries. Yesterday's post was specifically about how boundaries create trust. And I talked about that particularly with regard to my experience with my 5-year-old daughter, where quite counterintuitively, it turns out sometimes saying no is the trust building thing you can do. Um, but although not always, sometimes saying yes. But I've had this uh, issue of boundaries, the kind of the principle of boundary setting and what it means to defend a boundary come up in other areas of my life as well. Sometimes in just a direct one-on-one relationship, sometimes in group settings. And I think, what I spoke about yesterday, which I sort of just summarized as being willing to set and maintain a clear boundary with a young person, with our child, our children, helps build trust because it gives them a sense that there are things they can push on in the world that don't move, and that creates stability and security. And the opposite of that, having sort of like boundary issues, as they're called, not knowing where boundaries are, not knowing how to maintain them, not knowing whether any boundary is really real. There's plenty of well documented evidence and research and experience to that kind of speaks to the difficulties that can create. But beyond the role of parenting, or beyond the experience of boundaries from the point of view of a young person, where boundaries are almost kind of arbitrary, right? Like a young person doesn't necessarily know why they can't do a certain thing. They might have a sense of understanding about it, and they might have a very deep and thorough understanding of it, but that's not necessarily necessary for the boundary to do its work with a young person. When you get a little older, and that gets harder, we want to understand why a boundary is where it is, why it moves under certain circumstances and doesn't move under others, why it can sometimes be violated and sometimes not, why it can sometimes be violated with impunity or sometimes not, why some people can violate a certain boundary with impunity but others can't. All these things, we become conscious of them as we become adult human beings, and we start to have to look at, well, what do our boundaries serve? What are they doing for us? What are they? How? Because they're doing the same thing that they're doing for a young person in some way. They're telling us what's real in the world, or at least where our always only partial and somewhat fictional perception of the world, within that, what's real. Knowing that a lot of that can be modified. What is a boundary today might not be one tomorrow. What is a non-negotiable boundary one day might become a negotiable boundary the next moment. But in the same way, so in other words, I'm reflecting now on my experience of boundaries within more of my like adult relationships, not so much with regard to my daughter, who's of course the primary 5-year-old that I interact with. Surprise. But in my adult relationships, boundaries have a kind of a similar role, in that if we reliably have clearly demarcated, this is a boundary for me, other adults trust you. They trust that because you're reliable. Something that is there's an ability to predict what's going to happen, how you're going to respond. There's a kind of integrity there. In some ways, integrity means functional structure. That's what integrity implies. If you talk about the body having integrity, the skeletal system having integrity, as we talk about in Qigong, we're trying to alleviate overly tense places and strengthen overly relaxed places in the body so that the whole system has alignment and integrity, which is to say functional structure. That's also true of the psyche. The psyche also needs functional structure. And when we are able to produce that, when we're able to manifest that, then we become reliable. We become somewhat predictable, not necessarily in the sense of like the predictable in the bad sense of being compulsive and being incapable of acting freely, but we become reliable and we become predictable in the sense of if you say you're going to do something, you're going to do it. If a certain kind of thing happens, here's how I'm going to approach it. Here's how I'm going to treat it. We make good on some of those agreements, on some of those proclamations that may be very subtle or that may be somewhat indirect, but that also ultimately I think on a lot of levels are very real. How we tell people we are going to engage with them on the one hand, and how we actually engage with them. If those two things are one thing, people trust us. There's hardly any more basic way to define trust. Trust doesn't mean, people trusting us doesn't mean they're going to agree with us, doesn't mean that the way they think about the way they talk about what they do and the way that they do what they do are the same as ours. But if ours are in alignment, then they know kind of where we stand. This has showed up for me in a number of, mostly I would call it more professional, but to some extent also personal contexts in the last couple days and even couple of weeks. And I've just noticed how important that alignment really is. Because when I have that alignment, and when I'm not hesitant about defining a boundary, in other words, when I'm not, in the pressure, under the pressure of a particular conversation or a particular group of people's opinions, if I don't feel like I have to potentially renegotiate or move or adjust or cave a boundary of my own in order to accommodate that perspective or those conversations, you'd think, kind of like telling a child who's asking for something, telling them no, you'd think that would provoke a response that would actually kind of inflame the disagreement or would invite like another wave of someone trying to assert their perspective. But the truth is, as long as this is coming from a totally non-combative, and I think 9 times out of 10 it should really be non-emotional place, my experience is that Just as with telling a child no when they really want something, or they're saying they want something over and over again, just as maintaining a firm boundary there actually results in greater trust, the same is true of our adult relationships. If someone can make my boundary cave, whether or not they agree with the boundary that I'm setting, if they can make it cave, and that, then I become less predictable to them. I become, in some ways, less trustworthy. Now, there's a big distinction here between letting a boundary cave and actually modifying my perspective on the basis of incoming information, because that is imperative. And when I say boundary, I don't mean keeping my perspective the same and defending it. That's not what maintaining a boundary means. Maintaining a boundary simply means the poise, the presence, the quality of consciousness from which I'm speaking. Let's say I'm having a conversation with you and we're disagreeing about something. If the boundary that I'm maintaining is the quality of consciousness with which I am engaging, so I'm coming from a place, ideally, optimally, of genuine objectivity, genuine interest in your perspective, genuine readiness to reevaluate my perspective, and a connection to the inherent joy of being in dialogue, because any conversation contains the joy of being if we are connected to the joy of being. So when I go into a conversation or even a debate, that's the boundary I'm trying to maintain. If I let that boundary collapse and I lapse into defensiveness, an emotionally charged attack or assertion of what I think, an unwillingness to reevaluate my own perspective, an unwillingness to be interested in your perspective, any of those things would signal a collapse in the boundary, and all of a sudden I have become a loose cannon for you, for my dialogue partner. Now you don't trust me, right? So, yeah, on some level, this stuff's sort of obvious, but the connection, the sort of like very clear connection between how this works in my life as a parent, and then how it works in my life as just another adult human being interacting with other adult human beings, has showed up for me as significant recently. It's been really a it has just been prominent. It's risen to the surface of my awareness a number of times over the past couple of days, and I've taken note. It's like, clearly this is something I'm supposed to notice, because it's integral to what I'm learning right now, where I'm going, and what matters to me. Being really clear about those boundaries, man, because then you can have trust. Then you can have an argument for an hour, not a unproductive argument, but hopefully a somewhat productive argument, or even with some unproductive detours, and get to the end of it and still, if anything, have greater trust than you did at the beginning, even if you haven't moved an inch. Even if nobody's perspective has moved an inch, which is unlikely after a productive conversation, but let's say nobody manages to change their mind, nobody manages to change anybody else's mind, that does not mean you can't have greater trust at the end of the conversation. And ultimately, that kind of shared trust is really what we're in the relationship for. That's what the relationship is ultimately about anyway. It's not about agreement. It's about trust. So that's, again, I think that's maybe why this notion of boundaries and the kind of like extrapolation that I've just gone through from how it works with my child into my more adult relationships, why that's showing up as significant for me right now. But I'd love to hear how, if this is something that resonates with you, if this is something you've experienced, if the way in which you either do maintain your boundaries or observe yourself not maintaining them, and then what those effects are. That's all part of the learning process that we all go through. I'd be curious to hear how some of this plays out in your experiences and in your life. So feel free to share a comment or to send me a video about this. I'd love to hear it. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you soon.